You're listening to Risk and Resolve, where leadership, business, and risk management collide. We bring you real conversations, sharp insights, and strategies for success. And now for your hosts, Ben Conner and Todd Hufford.
Welcome back to another episode of Risk and Resolve. I'm Ben Conner with Todd Hufford, and our special guest across the pond is Chris Deacon, author of the Great American Healthcare Heist. Chris, thanks for being with us today.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited for the conversation.
Yeah, so a little bit on Chris's bio. Chris Deacon is a nationally respected voice on healthcare reform, procurement strategy, and government accountability, a former deputy attorney general and special assistant counsel in the Christie administration. Kristen spent years practicing law before transitioning to public finance, where she ultimately served as a senior official in the New Jersey Department of the Treasury. There, she led the procurement and policy for the state health benefits and school employees health benefits program, covering more than 820,000 public sector lives and representing one of the largest health plans in the country. Chris left the state service in 2021 when her moral compass pointed her in a different direction. Frustrated by a system rigged against patients, taxpayers, and public servants, she has since dedicated herself to speaking hard truths on stages, in legislatures, and in the halls of Congress, and in her latest book, The Great American Healthcare Heist, about the healthcare status quo and the structural forces that keep it broken. Her advocacy is grounded not only in deep policy knowledge and firsthand experience, but in deep personal drive. As a mother of three, Coleman, Emmer, and Collins, and a dog mom to Twitch, which we saw before we hit record, Kristen is fiercely committed to building a better future for the next generation. Off the stage and off the podcast, Chris is a lifelong athlete, avid reader, and a hobby historian with a particular fascination for Eastern European military history. She brings the same tenacity and intellectual curiosity to everything she does, whether it's taking on opaque middlemen in healthcare or uncovering the lost lessons of past conflicts. So I'm pumped for the conversation today. Chris, I've been able to hear you several times, and obviously we've passed in the halls of conferences and otherwise. But before we dive into the healthcare side of things, briefly mention in your bio going from getting your law degree to ending up managing a health plan. But if you could dive in a little bit to what that journey looked like, and really even getting into politics, government, or whatever that looked like for you.
Sure. So when I graduated from law school, I really was open to the type of law that I wanted to practice and career that I wanted to have for myself. And fortunately or unfortunately, I graduated in 2008, right as the financial crisis was hitting. And all of my classmates were getting deferred or laid off and losing all of the very lucrative jobs that they thought they were going to have. I kept mine and went right into the bankruptcy and restructuring group. So I learned very early on, corporate restructuring. And I think it was a great intro to what I eventually, and now I'm doing, which is really attacking problems, identifying structural weaknesses, in businesses, and trying to turn them around, quickly and strategically. In fact, that's the reason that I call my workbook the Health Plan Turnaround. It's available on Amazon as well. It's a workbook for employer plan sponsors that are just getting started on this journey to really ground them in what it means to be a fiduciary, et cetera. But the idea is just like a trustee would come in and, need to turn around a company from in the red to the black. We can do the same thing with healthcare. So I started my career in bankruptcy, and then decided when I had children that I wanted a little bit more work-life balance. So I went into public sector. So instead of working 70 hours a week, I cut back to 50 and went to the Attorney General's office, where I really started getting involved in the health benefits program. because we were counseling the health benefits program for the state. Subsequently got pulled to the governor's office. And, I will say a stroke of luck, but also a lot of hard work and tenacity and expressing of interest. Once I sort of caught the bug for healthcare and running the state health plan, I was going to get that job, and I worked really hard to get it. And that's how I found myself in this business.
Yeah. What can you recall? You said caught the bug to get into the health benefit space. Do you remember like the first couple instances where you were like, "That's interesting," or this shouldn't be that hard," or whatever that was?
Yeah, I would say the first was I was involved when I was at the AG's office and looking at a case involving Medco, subsequently Express Scripts, in the manipulation of the word rebate, and how you could sort of trace the changing definition of the term rebate in the PBM contract with a client, and then also see the change between the PBM and the manufacturers, and how, so I was sort of intrigued at the start. And I would say the big hook was the first meeting. We had a kickoff for one of the first things we did was run an RFP for our third-party administrator. And at that kickoff meeting, our consultant sort of, took the stage to present to us how we were going to conduct the RFP. And they said, there's two primary evaluation components, discount and disruption. And after explaining what those terms meant, I very simply asked, discount off what? We have to know the X.
Absolutely.
And, the response was, well, that's not how it's done. And then on disruption, I said, I understand we don't want people to have to move doctors, and we want to minimize certain disruption. But if we lose, the bottom 10% of providers that provide low value care, have poor quality outcomes, and have really high prices, like, don't I want that disruption? And they had no response for that either. So it was light bulbs of like, there is so much opportunity to do innovative, challenging work here. And that's when I really sort of fully committed, I would say.
Yeah. It's interesting because those seem like fairly logical questions. And the responses like that, they were just total brain busters that like, how dare you ask
Right.
those questions? So you get the job, you're now overseeing, what do you call new folks from New Jersey?
No,
Is it New Jerseyans?
Gardeners.
Gardens. I don't know. So I wasn't born in New
Gardeners.
Jersey. It is my adopted home. I moved around a lot as a kid. I was the daughter of a Black Hawk pilot, so I've lived in a lot of different places. But I've called New Jersey home. Called New Jersey home for over 20 years. So New Jerseyans, I guess.
Sure. Let's go. So you oversaw the health plan for hundreds of thousands of New Jerseyans, and so you're in the seat. So what? First of all, how long did you hold that seat for the health plan of New Jersey?
About 3 years.
3 years. So what was that 3-year period? How would you describe that? And what were some really key things that stood out to you as you just uncover the madness of what a health plan is?
I look back on those 3 years as some of the probably some of the most challenging times. Also note that was late 18, 19 to late 21. So in the midst of that, we had a health plan of 800,000 people in a global pandemic. So there was a lot going on. But ultimately, like, the most rewarding really job I've ever had, and I don't know that I will ever be able to beat it, because we were, and the staff too, especially the staff, working with members on, individual issues, not just the big issues, but, the getting a member a drug or making sure that they were able to walk through the appeals process. You're changing lives, right? Like, it might not seem like it sort of in this macro, conference room, but when you actually speak to somebody, I had the occasion a few times to speak to individuals who we were able to solve problems for, and the gratitude and the emotion, because this is their child, right? Like, this is their spouse, this is their life. And we have a very unique position as health benefits leaders and consultants to have a real impact. So it was a wonderful experience. And despite how it seems to have ended, it was, I'll always look back on it fondly, and with the people I worked with.
Sure. Yeah, and changing lives, or helping, change other people's lives. It seems like it certainly changed yours.
Absolutely.
So you talked about how it ended. Despite how it ended was, I think, your words. So talk about that process of it ending and just kind of what you discovered. I mean, ultimately in your book, and I have a copy here, and recommend everyone get a copy of Chris's book, The Great American Healthcare Heist. But obviously you stumbled into something that was probably just, you just couldn't believe it. So talk about what that was like, stumbling into that, and then just kind of the pathway towards what it looked like to come to an end there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I would say in and around, so we had a new contract. I just described that RFP process that resulted in a contract being awarded to Horizon Blue Cross Blue Shield for plan year 2020 for 3 years. And we had some really unique terms in that contract, like unit cost guarantees, not discount guarantees, but unit cost guarantees. And we also had navigation and advocacy services as a part of that contract. And we were just not seeing the results that were promised. And so, there was some digging on, how we could improve. And that ultimately, the story in the book that I sort of open with has to do with some of those services, navigation and advocacy services, that we were paying for, but did not seem to be getting. Just a quick anecdote. I remember having a call with the vendor and challenging them. We had secret shopper calls done. The product was not working. The trigger words were not, if you said shoulder surgery, right? Like, that should have indicated that the person taking the call should have asked, like, have you tried physical therapy? Or did you know we have a Centers of Excellence program, or whatever? And they all sort of fell very flat. And I was so confident in how poorly it was being conducted that I actually put everyone on speaker and called the number for the navigation and advocacy services live and on the spot, and made everybody listen. And I fed them keywords, and it was like failure after failure after failure. And that was a really impactful meeting, as you might imagine. But to go back, as you said, we just weren't performing as we should, caused me to dig in and look at the numbers. And ultimately, what was the subject of the $100 million settlement that was just announced a few weeks ago was discovered because I was looking at a file completely unrelated to what I eventually found. We were implementing a payment integrity service, and I was trying to understand the scope of out-of-state services, like what was our spend, and from a quantity of claim and a financial perspective, and sort of saw something that jumped out and led me down this rabbit hole. And ultimately, I was a bulldog. I was tenacious. I was not letting this go with the vendor, and was essentially told at the end of the day, they are our vendor. If you can't get on board with that and move forward and do other things, then this probably isn't the place for you. And so it became not the place for me. And ultimately ended up filing the whistleblower complaint a few months after I left.
Where, I mean, there's something internal, obviously, for you to say, like, something isn't right. And where does that come from? What is it inside of you that drives you forward in something like this, where most people would just, go along to get along?
I think I've always had that personality and I think my parents would probably agree with that, to be sort of out front. And I think it's part of being a leader. So I would say that I've had a piece of that, and whether it's arguing about homecoming float or, something in second grade, or something as serious as this, I don't back down from challenge. I think I seek it, in many ways, when it presents itself, and I also believe, and I've always said this, that not everybody can be a whistleblower, that even, if they see something amiss or fraudulent or something that shouldn't be happening. I was in an incredibly privileged position of having financial security at home, right? I was going to be able to make my home payment if I left my job, right? And so I felt almost as if it was a responsibility, right? I was in this point in my life where I could stand up and take the bullets, and fire the shots, because again, I was in this, sort of a privileged position to do that. And I think it's really important to recognize that not everybody is, right? Sometimes you just have to put your head down and keep going because you have kids that need medication or you need to feed your family. So I take that as a responsibility and almost as an obligation, because I was in a position to do it and to stand up for others that couldn't.
I appreciate your humility in that, but also, like, I think it's worthy to call out. Like, I would assume, just simple math in my head just now, that the New Jersey budget for health benefits was probably over $1 billion, or around $1 billion.
About
And
7.
7. Oh, yikes.
Yeah.
So what, uh, you talk about, well, I could pay my mortgage and that kind of thing, but that's a high stakes game when you're a whistleblower around that much money.
Yeah. And
That's where weird stuff starts happening, and that takes a ton of courage, because, if it's one thing to go broke, it's another to, like, just
yeah.
totally have everything taken away, and, you know, have your family
Right.
affected and it being taken to the nth degree. Like, how did you mentally walk through that?
Well, in many ways, I still am, and I'll get there. But I did have a very frank conversation with my husband, about the implications, because I knew how much money we were talking about, and the settlement doesn't even begin to cover it.
No.
And you're right. When we talk about that much money, and when we talk about people's careers and jobs on the other side, and possibly, I think, again, the complaint will never get, we will never go through discovery to really flesh everything out. But I very much believed we were in, like, orange jumpsuit territory. And that's when, as you said, people can get desperate. So that was, yeah, it was a concern. And I think that we had the conversation. It was ultimately, like, my decision, what do you believe is right and that you can do? And, I didn't go jogging on an empty road by myself at night, or,
Mm.
and I always had, the cops and the unions, were some of my biggest advocates. So, I did feel a little bit more comfort. And obviously now I'm here, across the pond in the UK, which I think is nice, not only from a, very, very, very potential, like, physical safety perspective, narrow, but also, like, if I want to turn off the news and the
Yeah.
chatter and the mudslinging, like, I can very easily do that and look out my backyard at the sheep. So, but fast forward, we brought this case, had to be, interviewed several times over the course of the 4 years. We had to stay silent for 4.5 years. And ultimately, I can say this now because So everything has been, transferred and all, but I was actually threatened by the state AG's office. The words criminal liability were mentioned because I had information that I had taken to form the basis of the whistleblower complaint that they concede resulted in the $100 million settlement. But I have had to deal with pretty egregious behavior directed towards me because I refuse to let this go.
Hmm.
And mention criminal, the word criminal, to a mom of 3 who, again, who has things to lose. I had to retain criminal counsel. And this is me trying to do the right thing, right? But yeah, and it's been an interesting learning experience.
The same kind of topic, Ben, reminds me of talking with Wellbridge and the founders there, a surgery center that was independent. And the comment I made to those guys was, the thing I've learned in life is that when you end up doing the right thing in this situation, you sometimes fail to remember or realize that it will cost you something. And so I just want to clarify to people that you didn't escape the country. You didn't run away. You're there for other family reasons.
Yes.
It just so happens to be a nice place to turn off the news and kind of go from there. Can you talk a little bit more? We talk about this settlement. We talk about the whistleblower case. So after you left, were you the match? Were you the one that struck the match on a lawsuit that ended up creating a case against the plan provider that then benefited dollars back to the state of New Jersey?
Yeah, I would say I was the primary match, and there were a couple other named plaintiffs who were part of the SHBP who had claims and documentation that supported some of the other theories of the case. And so there were other quote unquote relators or whistleblowers, but the AG's office, I could think would agree with this. The case doesn't happen without what I gave them. Yeah.
And it was the state AG's office that had to bring the case against the vendor, correct?
Right. So that's the way that what's called a key TAM case works is we bring forward sort of the allegations, but it's false claims against the state or false claims from a federal perspective, right? Like that's why False Claims Act cases, when there's Medicare dollars involved or Medicaid. And in this case, there were federal dollars at issue. They were dwarfed by the amount of state dollars at issue, but that's what ultimately got it in, why it's a federal court case, because there were both federal and state jurisdiction, but the state AG's office was the party that ultimately decided to intervene. And so, I think that's important to note, like the complaint that was unsealed as a result of that settlement is not the complaint that was filed. So the complaint that was filed in 2021 and amended in 2022, that is much lengthier and more detailed, that remains under seal. And legally, sort of the presumption is it should be unsealed as part of this process. However, the settlement agreement seems to contemplate that there will be a motion made by the defendants to keep it forever sealed. And that will ultimately play out in the courts. We'll obviously oppose it. We think it's very important that make it into the public domain.
So if I understand this right, we've got different grievances, multiple different grievances. Which ones were actually unsealed and that the settlement applied to? Was it something related to discounts or drugs or something else we didn't talk about?
It was ultimately there was a contractual provision in our contract that we drafted that says the state will never pay more, or we will always pay the lesser of the negotiated rate or the billed amount. And the way I like to put it is, I'm never paying above sticker price, right? So often we're told in this business, like, oh, don't pay attention to the bill. Those are funny numbers. There's always a huge discount. Like, don't even look at the bill, right? The bill means nothing. Well, in this case, the bill was less, or in these cases, the bill was actually less than the plan paid amount. And, I remember very clearly the first time I saw this, again, sort of stumbling upon it because I was looking at this file for a completely different reason. And I saw, billed amount, $675,000 approximately, plan paid amount, 2.1 million.
Wow.
And I was like, whoa, what? No. And I actually approached them and I said, I think there's a mistake in this can't be right. And no, they said it was right. And I think, and then the other piece of it was discovering that the explanation of benefits that was generated for our members had a material misstatement in it because it never, to play that example out, your EOB has, the billed amount, the allowed amount, the plan paid amount.
Right.
And their systems were programmed to show 675, 675, 675, even though we know that 2.1 was actually paid. And, I think that that's significant because if you get an EOB that says New York Presbyterian got $2.1 million on a $675,000 bill, like you might pick up the phone and call your employer and say, this doesn't seem right.
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 Yeah.
But
Well, the receipt is wrong, right?
Well, right. So, en masse mailing knowingly false explanations of benefits
Correct.
was pretty problematic.
So are there other grievances that were part of a different case or part of the same case that are still sealed that could result in even more hundreds of millions of dollars that you're kind of sitting there in England saying, I don't know if that'll ever see the light of day?
So unfortunately, fortunately a settlement was reached, substantial monies. I think it signals to the market like it was a positive thing for the state. Unfortunately, that agreement wipes out all of the claims that are in this remaining, complaint that is remaining sealed at this time. But again, we hope that it becomes unsealed. But that again is a much lengthier complaint with other theories. And, because it's sealed, I can't obviously talk about the details of it. But there would be other monies there, but the $100 million sort of wipes out everything that was alleged in both complaints.
This kind of reminds me of a phrase that I never heard until I got into insurance, but now I hear every day recently, even on the way into the office today, most favored nations. And that language around pricing and discounts. And to your point earlier, you made the point, discount off what? And I remember asking that question early in my career. And I got a lot of indignant responses of, well, why would you ask that? I think you've only been in the industry a couple of years, young man. And it's like, yeah. And I'm the one asking a real basic question. So can you just give me a real basic answer? And they never could. And that's to me what kind of turned the light bulb in my head early on to say, this is a game. And I'm not on the right side of it in many cases to help people unless I have information. And that's the key to everything.
Yeah, I can't tell you and I think that was why I was like, no, I'm onto something. The look of disbelief that I had the audacity to ask such a question and being fairly new to the industry, oh, well, that's how we do it. That's just, we can't share that information.
They have the same play, the
shock look.
Oh my gosh, how would you ask that? They do that every time, everywhere, every situation.
I was once at a conference and spoke before, I think it was in front of it was a few thousand union members. And I was giving my opinion, and this was several years ago, so maybe 4 or 5 years ago, on some of the patient harm that can result in a high deductible health plan that isn't managed correctly, and education and communication, where that's lacking, how it can be harmful, and some of the potential ramifications, like delaying care if you don't have that, the right system set up. And an older gentleman got up and spoke after me, and he looked down at me and he said, I don't know how old you are, but you're not old enough to know how this works. And I think he threw in a few, but it was, Yes.
Wow.
Terrible.
So I even recently saw an article of, talking about the $100 million settlement, and also about one of the governor's appointees being now appointed to the board of that insurance organization. So kind of what's your take on, we talked about the process, what's been filed. What's your take ultimately on the capstone of that process of you being a whistleblower and saying this isn't right and standing up uh, for your state, I would say for the American public, for healthcare consumers? What's your take on, that situation in particular? And then ultimately, like, what just happened?
Well, I think I described it in a post as that appointment. So it was an individual who's been with the administration for 8 years, a sort of a career campaign guy who's worked on campaigns for his entire career. He is strategic advisor to the Murphy administration for the full 8 years. And as you said, a week to the day after the settlement was announced, between the AG's office and Horizon, he was appointed to the board for very, very well paid, very minimal work job. And I described it as a giant middle finger. I might not have used those words, but a giant middle finger to the state of New Jersey and the people of New Jersey.
Yeah.
The settlement, the big talk about holding big industry accountable, and you can go back and listen to the press conference, but then to appoint somebody with zero healthcare experience, clearly a political move, and a thank you for your service for the last 8 years, because we have 8-year term limits here. Parting gift, right? Here you go.
Mhm.
I viewed it as a giant middle finger, because it just, it basically said, they got their slap on the wrist, and we're all still friends.
Back to business. Yeah.
Well, and I think too, if you read the actual terms of the settlement agreement, some of the nuance, the state can't hold this settlement and the conduct alleged, can't hold that against it in future evaluations and RFPs. And in fact, the RFP was conducted during the investigation, like during the last 4.5 years. Horizon was awarded another contract, and not just a contract, it was awarded a contract for a longer length of time than traditionally we've ever given a contract for TPA services. So it went from 3 years to 4 years. So yeah, they were given another contract during the investigation, and this can't be used against them in the future.
Well, Chris, how many
So
years in the last 20 has Horizon not been the plan administrator for the state of New Jersey?
for the existence of the state health benefits program, Horizon has been the vendor. At times, there have been 2 vendors, and I would say the second vendor, Aetna, I believe, has some of the commercial lives. Never more than 10%. Because people of New Jersey, fortunately or unfortunately, because of that dynamic, they very much view the cross and the shield as their insurance, right?
Yeah.
If you change that logo on their card, there is a tremendous amount of angst and confusion, because of the way that the plan has been, run for 30 years. And again, it takes you back to that conversation that I had in late 2021. The message was, they are our vendor, right? They've been our vendor for 30 years. They might be our vendor, for the
Next 30.
however long it is currently in existence. And that's just how it's going to be.
So the state of New Jersey is funding their own settlement from Horizon. Just a
Yeah.
couple of those billed charges or overbilled charges, right? And then it'll make it back. So I imagine this experience and going through that experience was the the match that said, I gotta write a book. I have to tell my story. I have to, obviously you have your motivation of why. Can you share a little bit about, the genesis of I need to write about this and your book, The Great American Healthcare Heist?
Yeah. So the book leads with some New Jersey stories, but ultimately, the book that will be written about the entirety of that experience, and some of which we just talked about, really couldn't be written and released until
Right.
this was all out in the open. So in the interim, what this book is about, the Great American Healthcare Heist, when I was speaking with employers and CFOs and even congressmen and state legislators and policymakers, there was no sort of book or tool or comprehensive publication, if you will, that not only touched on, let's say, PBMs or hospitals, but actually covered the structural, again, how the structure perpetuates itself and why we are stuck. And really hits at all of the, hits at the middlemen, pharmaceutical companies, PBMs, carriers, and tries to lay that out in a way that makes a compelling case for, something needs to be done. The goal ultimately would be that you read this book, and again, whether you are somebody who just picked it up at Barnes and Noble or a leader and a policy leader, you read this book and you can no longer see the world in the same way. And I know that sounds like very sort of hyperbolic, but what I mean is when you go and walk down the street and you see, or drive down the street and you see a new tower going up, or you see, like in New Jersey, I saw this, an old mall, an old defunct, Simon Mall, was being turned into a Cooper ambulatory surgery center, right? Or you see your professional sports team plastered with your nonprofit hospital systems, advertisements all over the jersey, all over the stadium, and in the luxury boxes. You can't, now like, holy, right? Like,
Yeah.
this is what she was talking about. Like, do we need that tower? Do we need more, beds? Do we need to advertise for millions of dollars for our professional sports teams? So again, that's sort of the goal, is you can walk through life a little bit differently.
So you also, you mentioned the workbook about the healthcare turnaround. And you even said from the book, you're laying out the case, like your law degree. I'm laying out the case of what's going on. And then you turn it into a workbook. What is the guiding principle for employers as they navigate a workbook? And what are some key takeaways you're hoping that employers, where the light bulb goes on for them?
Yeah, I think it's part education and part through that education empowerment, and in feeling like they can ask the hard questions. I can't tell you how many times I've been a part of a conversation with an employer and a vendor where, even language, right? Like language about data, language about contracts, language about claims and claims processing is essentially weaponized and used against the employer by, making it sound way more complex and up here than the employer feels comfortable with. So the workbook will walk you through, and for some it would be elementary, but like understanding your numbers, like fill in what's your PEPM, what is it for your pharmaceutical spend, what is it for your medical spend, and forcing you to go through the exercise of going to figure out the answers to those questions. Mm-hmm. And then really just giving you some of that, how to talk like a data expert, right? You don't need to be an expert, but like, these are the terms you need to know. So when they try to weaponize HIPAA and say, no, we can't share that with you because HIPAA, like, you actually know, that HIPAA is not spelled with 2 P's, what it means. And right. And you know that in fact, HIPAA supports your position because it requires you to keep data in that format. And that's the format I want. Yeah. So again, education, empowerment, and it's sometimes this can feel really daunting and overwhelming, I think, so much so that a lot of employers, especially the small and mid, kind of say like, Chris, you had 800,000 lives. Like, I don't have that
Right.
leverage. You might have some different tools in your toolbox, and some of your tools, like, I don't have or didn't have, right? Our tools might look different, but we both have tools. We both have limitations. But the size of the problem shouldn't stand in your way of trying to address it.
Yeah. That's a little comical to me when you bring up HIPAA, because that is like the go-to, like if you ask any sort of like question, it's like, well, that's HIPAA. So like, I'm not going to give you an answer. And it's like, if you say that to me again, I'm going to lose my mind. I am
only
so
go there
over that as a response.
after they say, how dare you ask the question? So it's
Yeah.
first, how dare you ask the question? And then it's, oh, you must not understand about HIPAA.
Yeah.
Right.
That is like the go-to.
It's definitely a weapon, but what you can do is, not only neutralize that weapon, but you can turn it into your own, right? Like, once you understand that, HIPAA is actually the law that required the standardization of these files and standard data transaction sets that are passing back and forth that you want. So I want what I know you have to have in order to access the banking system, right? In order to access the transaction, the clearinghouse for your funds, right? You have to keep the data in this way. So I know you have it, and that's what I want, right? So you can turn it into your own, turn it into your own benefit.
Yeah. So you talked about the workbook and just general, steps that employers can walk through. As you've gone on this journey in your experience with managing the health plan and writing the book, and you've gone and you've spoken across the country, what's your advice for employers as they manage a health plan? And the reason why I ask is you've received and I'm assuming that you've received all the reasons why people can't. Oh, well, this is my individual problem. So how can I do this? And so I feel like you would, with that assumption, you would likely say, well, I've heard all the excuses and all the reasons. So therefore, my advice for for small, medium-sized employers, what would that look like?
Yeah, I think, probably a bit of macro and a bit of micro. Like, from a macro perspective, my advice would definitely, or I guess my message would be that you can start tomorrow, and you can start small. And I think especially addressing like the size of the employer, that's one I get a lot, is like, but we're so small, or we're not big enough to have the leverage to ask for these things. That no employer is too small. In fact, you can be more nimble in some ways. So have the audacity to ask the hard questions. And from a micro perspective, I think it starts with data. Get your data, ask for your data, and be relentless. And, with that in mind, you have to be willing to walk.
Yeah,
right? Like, that is
100%.
probably my final word of advice is that is your leverage. Like, big, small, like, they need your business. And whether that's your contract manager, that one sales rep, like, they need your business. Your leverage is in being able to walk. And if you are not willing to do that, you have drastically reduced the size of your toolbox. So, yeah,
I
think
totally agree with that. I am so glad you said that. And at the time of this recording, we're finishing up Q4, if you will, and it is just you see two separate types of buyers. You see ones that like prioritize continuity, and you see others that prioritize the deliverable of the most effective offer for their employees, whatever that may be.
right.
The employers that are willing to walk and have a strategy we have a strategy, we have guardrails, and sometimes it doesn't go perfect. But that employer that like doesn't care, they want a good deliverable. That's important, but doesn't have to be, company A.
Right.
They have a far better result than the other that care about continuity.
Right.
And the reality is, I don't think their employees care. Because we even had an employer that reduced their employees' healthcare premiums by 10% last year. And then they bumped it like 2% this year. And the employees were mad. They totally forgot. They didn't care about the 10% reduction.
Right.
And the point of that is just to show like the continuity. You think it's this big thing. And if you communicate well to employees and tell them why you're doing what you're doing and that you're protecting their paycheck and you care about high quality healthcare, there's buy-in and they trust you. And, there's a responsibility with that. But it's just fascinating to me, the difference with employers that are willing to walk. And you're right about small employers and knowing their information. And we simply know that by managing our own health plan. So Conner Insurance, little old Conner Insurance in Indianapolis, self-funded with 35 employees on the plan. And we're willing to walk and we know our information. And for 2026, we're able to make a great decision because of that. Right. And we communicated to our employees, hey, here's what the next year to 3 years likely is going to look like for us because of what we know about our information. So recently, I wanted to bring up with you about the Johnson & Johnson lawsuit that was kind of all the rage, 2 years ago about this is going to be like the cornerstone of fiduciary management leadership of a health plan. This is going to turn the tide where we're going to be more like a 401k plan, less like this craziness of, robbery in a health plan. But that's been dismissed. And I think it's been rather disappointing. I'd want to get your take on, what was being set up, what were we hoping for, and how large is this disappointment?
Yeah, so the J&J case was definitely all the rage. And I have to say, I'm not afraid to eat crow because I was one of the ones saying 4 years ago that an onslaught of these lawsuits were going to occur, and that the lawyers were going to have a field day because we were just going to see a parade of fiduciary breach lawsuits being brought by classes of employees against employers. J&J's suit was sort of the first, so that's why there was so much excitement. But as time's gone on, I think that we've certainly been, I would say, disappointed, but observed that the courts aren't buying it, right? Mm-hmm. And what happened ultimately in the J&J case is the court dismissed for lack of standing, so lack of Article III standing. And just quick refresher, in that case, the allegations were that the J&J mismanaged or didn't prudently manage their PBM contract. And as a result, their members were forced to not only pay higher premiums, but higher point of sale costs at the pharmacy counter because of the way that there was steering on the formulary to higher cost drugs, or like mandatory higher cost drugs. So, for a drug you could have gotten for $10, because of the way that the PBM contract was managed, you now had to pay $100. And I'm just making up numbers, but those are the allegations. Right. And ultimately, this is one of now several dismissals that have happened in this space. But the court found that the harm was too speculative, right? Because the employer could have changed their co-payments and co-insurance and premium contribution. They could have changed that whenever they wanted. And they could have increased it such that she might not have really been financially harmed. Like that was That was one of the lines, right? Is that it's too speculative because we don't know what employers would have done otherwise. And she got all of the benefits to which she was entitled as an employee. Again, that judge's position, not mine. Now, the really interesting part about this dismissal that is different from the other cases and it is, for me, a bridge way too far and fundamentally demonstrates the judiciary's lack of understanding of this space, is the judge went so far as to say, while Ms. Lewandowski might have paid $200 at the counter instead of 10, right? And that, yes, in that instance, there might have been some financial harm. That year, that plan year, the plan paid over $200,000 in claims. Therefore, was she really harmed? No. They did the same thing with another plaintiff. They said, yeah, he had to pay more at the counter. Okay. But even so, the plan paid out $120,000 on claims for Mr. So-and-so. Did he really lose? Was he really financially harmed? The court ultimately found no. For obvious
Do they not
reasons.
even take premium into consideration on that?
No, they don't take premium into consideration. No.
So that's just the thing.
Yeah. So, I mean, if you take this, the slippery slope approach and take it to its logical conclusion, what you're telling me is in order to demonstrate financial harm in that transaction, she would have had to not incur any other claims. Is
Right.
that where we're going? Right. So yeah, I believe it's clear reversible error. I think that, on the other findings or, conclusions of law, I might not agree with them, but I can understand the logic and the reasoning from a legal perspective. This is dangerous to me, to take the reasoning that yeah, but you got $500,000 worth of claims paid, right? So you could never you could never show financial harm. Like, how much pain do you have to feel at the pharmacy counter? And given how much hospital bills, if you went to the ER once, you can't be a plaintiff. No ERISA rights for you. So anyway, that's what the court held. They do have an opportunity to file another complaint, an amended complaint. I don't see how you cure that. Which is why I think that there has been a clear reversible error that could be appealed. Obviously, I'm not the one paying the legal bill, so I have no say in this, but hopefully somebody will challenge that, because that would be very problematic if that was in any way precedential for future cases. But I also think all of the enterprising attorneys out there that were sort of sitting on the sidelines saying, let's see how this one goes, and then we're going to come in hot with all of the class, the plaintiffs that we've gathered, they're moving on. Their next big thing is processed foods, probably. Just reading the tea leaves, I could be wrong. But which means, and I think that this is the important part, we've focused on fiduciary obligations for the last 3 years. I would say, as an industry, we've said fiduciaries important. You have to be a good fiduciary. If you're not, you're going to get sued, right? That's been a lot of what's been coming out on stage from folks talking about why it's so important to be a fiduciary. I think that, and again, it was one of those early on. I think I was wrong. I think that the carrot approach versus the stick, meaning not fiduciary because we don't want to get sued, but let's be good fiduciaries because that's the right thing to do. And there's a reason you have a fiduciary obligation. It's because you're exercising discretion over other people's money, right? You're exercising discretion over your employees' money. So you have to take extra special care of that, not only for those employees, but for your business. And so execute on those principles, not because you don't want to get a lawsuit served on you, but because it's the right thing to do. You will have a better health plan. You'll have happier members. You will have a lower cost, for all the right reasons. Do it for the right reasons, not because you don't want to get sued.
Yeah, and I think that's where, when I mentioned disappointment earlier, was it's not disappointment that I want, these employers to get whacked with a stick. Certainly don't want that, but we want to see positive change in a system that really is embedded to extract money from employers and their employees. And something has to break loose. And unfortunately, it seems that, there's a moat that that hasn't been breached yet on that. We've had a couple L's, if you will, of, New Jersey paying $100 million settlement on a $7 billion budget, like that's nothing. Or
Right.
the dismissal of J&J, which again, does that change the trajectory of the healthcare system? So where are you at with kind of what's next of how to restructure a system or replace a system that is tragic to the American individual and the American economy?
Yeah. So again, I think that the F word, fiduciary, does not become irrelevant. It becomes how we frame it and how we use it. So I would continue to harp on the importance of being a fiduciary, not because it's a box checking exercise or something that the DOL requires of you, but because if you actually look at the principles and the framework, it's the right way to do business, right? So I would say, definitely don't lose sight of that. And then to go back to recognizing that, like, this isn't a one size fits all approach. And it's also not healthcare is very local. So what might be right for an employer with, all of their employees in one region versus an employer that might have remote workers across the country, your approaches and the tools in your toolbox might look different.
Right.
So, just going back to some of those principles that we talked about earlier, ask the hard questions, challenge the status quo, be willing to walk, I think is huge. So I do think that we are moving. If I had my crystal ball and a little bit of magic to get us there, what I want to see is us moving the purchaser and the patient, purchaser being the employer,
Correct.
And the provider of the healthcare services, our hospitals, our doctors, closer together and removing all the crap in the middle.
That's
right? This is what's growing. They're not making more, right? Maybe the CEO and CFO and all the other administrators are. Certainly we're not getting more. We're getting sicker and paying more and getting less value. So what's happening to our $4.9 trillion, right? It's falling through the middle with all of the middlemen that we are creating and they are creating. So the more we can sort of get back to the basics, and whether that looks like direct contracting, whether that looks like direct primary care, it sounds like, this is the future, right? But in many ways, it's like getting back to the basics of restoring the relationship as closely as it can be. I mean, yes, there will have to be intermediaries, but if we could go from like 27 to 2 or 3, that would be ideal.
But Chris, if you were a builder of toll roads, you would want to find an area between 2 large metro centers where you would have the most passage. So if you were in the country in the early 1900s and you said, okay, we had the Rockefellers, we had the Carnegies where they were very central figures and we broke all those trusts up and we can't do it like that again. But if I'm the government or I'm a business and I want to build a proverbial toll road on a road that I think has a lot of traffic, I can create automobile gas insurance policies. I can create grocery bill insurance policies, or wait. I can create health insurance policies. Yeah, that's it, because that road has the most traffic on it. And if I set up big enough, strong enough toll booths, I can start by charging a penny per car, a penny per transaction. And then as time goes on, I can raise that because there's no other road they can go on.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So now today we have these corporations that are sort of faceless in the sense that it's not a Carnegie, it's not a Mellon, it's not a Rockefeller. Although we do see obviously the attacks on CEOs,
Mhm.
but you kind of wonder who's really benefiting. It's the shareholders, it's the pension funds that own shares in these companies. What would happen if tomorrow, above the fold, Financial Times, we see an article that says, Communist China linked major corporation takes 35% share ownership of United Healthcare? Like, we're mad now because it feels greedy. We're
Right.
mad now because we feel like our peers, some other American has built a toll booth and they're taking advantage of other Americans. That's just, that's that righteous indignation you felt when you did the whistleblower and all that stuff. But what changes when we realize we've created a toll booth which could be sold
Mhm.
to an adversary? And
Right.
now, as Ben mentioned, these plans are extracting profit and capital out of U.S. businesses. What happens when that control gets lost? You've created this robot that's serving you. What happens when someone taps into the robot's hard wiring and takes over and the robot turns on you? You ever thought about that?
Well, in the context of AI, yes, I have thought about that. But no, it's a great point to really drive home the real harm that is being perpetuated by allowing the monopolization of this space. Because yes, to your point, like, does it feel really yucky to see, United CEO having private jets and all the rest of it and all the sort of excess? Yeah, especially knowing like on whose back they're doing that. But you're right to say like, okay, maybe the problem is, somebody that we don't trust comes in and now owns it.
Right.
That's like a national security risk, like massively.
Massive.
Right. What percentage of financial transactions does change? We know from the cyber attack that it literally shuts down the system.
Right.
So, and you would have thought that incident would have driven home the point that like we are in dangerous territory here because of our reliance on very few, very big actors. But we'll continue to hold hearings in DC and write reports.
Good.
Well, and Todd, to your analogy, it's not just the toll booth and the toll road; it's the asphalt company, it's the car manufacturer, it's the car maintenance and repair organization, it's the gas companies,
They're all
it's the
linking
EV
together.
charging stations, are all owned by the toll road.
Yep.
So
it's not owned by, controlled by.
Yeah, correct. So that pothole that you keep hitting, why would I fill it in? You keep coming to my repair shop and I sell you tires and all that kind of stuff.
Or you can drive the toll road, but you have to drive this kind of car.
Yeah. So
Right.
it's a slippery slope, and that's the next level of danger outside of it being low quality compared to what we're paying and all those sorts of things. But last thing, Chris, you've had the honor and opportunity to testify in the U.S. Senate. That sounds equal parts really fun and also like stressful. What was that experience like for you?
Oh, I'm 90% in the fun bucket. Yeah, the only stressful part was the travel and getting there. No, it's an incredible honor and opportunity to be asked to testify before any body, whether it's state legislature or at the federal level, but certainly at the Senate. I testified before the Senate Aging Committee and also the Senate Help Committee most recently. I have to say that the Senate Help Committee hearing was one of the most constructive hearings I have ever been witness to. And I'm not just saying that because I was a part of it. And I'm not saying it was because I was a part of it, but I think it was, there was so much common ground between some pretty like diverse groups of people, right? We had Senator Sanders, talking, and we had Senator Cassidy speaking, and their solutions to the healthcare affordability crisis look quite different at their endpoints. But one of, they're leaving from the same destiny or same starting point, which is more transparency in the system. Like, we have to understand the problems we have before we can begin to build solutions. And again, Senator Sanders' solution might look very different from Senator Cassidy's, but there was more common ground than there was divergence that we talked about in that hearing. And there was a genuine interest. Folks had read all of the materials that were submitted and even asked about a specific claim that I had highlighted in my 37-page written testimony. So it's fun. My favorite part of any talk or conference is question and answer, because we're having a dialogue, and that's what it felt like. So happy to go back at any time. And it was definitely an honor.
That's awesome. I think you mentioned it was 90% fun, and that kind of, for me, I think highlights one of your superpowers, and something that I have a lot of respect for is just how prepared you are, and how you understand the facts and you can recall them, and you're clear and confident in your communication, which, when you're prepared and you're confident and you're clear in your message, that gives you the space to have fun.
Yeah.
It gives you space to let it rip and enjoy a conversation, that's one of your superpowers for sure.
I don't know if you both are athletes or were athletes in our former lives, but I'm sure there was a famous athlete at some point that talked about, the game's fun, and you can, because you've prepared. I know I've put in the time. I know I've put in the hours, so that when I step out onto the court, or step out onto the field, I have the confidence to play my game and to have fun with it. Right. And so I think it's the same if you take that attitude to your professional life. If you become, to the extent you can, if you become a master in the subject matter, and read and really dedicate yourself to understanding not just your position, but I regularly read revenue cycle management blogs and hospital CFO blogs and listen to their podcasts. I'm all over when it comes to where I'm getting my information, so that when I step out on the court or into the conference room, I hope to have as good a grasp as I can, so that, I can enjoy the game.
Right. From a basketball perspective, which played and coached basketball, is, you work on all these different skills so that you can trust it when you're, when you're performing. Right. And you just talked about, in an example, you work on your dribbling and your shooting and your passing. You're not just only focused on the one thing, shooting or whatever is the echo chamber that you stay in, and that kind of thing, which again allows you to get out there and have a lot of fun. And it's interesting too. We literally had this conversation yesterday in a leadership conversation, that the fun in doing this, you brought up sports. The fun in sports isn't getting out there and clowning around with your friends. In fact, that's what that was the lie. We always thought of it, hey, let's just have some fun and let's go play. And then you get out there with your buddies and you're not prepared, and you get your butt kicked. You get your butt handed to you, and it's not fun at all. Maybe it was fun driving there together, but that experience isn't fun at all. But when you have a mission alignment and you prepare and you take joy in the performance, that's actually where you walk away and you're like, that was a blast.
Yeah.
What we just did and what we were able to accomplish was so fun. Let's continue doing that thing. So I totally agree with you on that. Well, Chris, we end our episode with 2 questions for our guests. So I'll ask the first one. What is a risk that you have taken that has changed your life?
Oh, moving to England.
Out of all of what we just talked to, moving to England.
No, I mean, I think one of the obvious ones would be the whistleblower complaint. But I think that that's just the one that comes to mind. Yeah. I do think it's been not only life-changing for me, but for our family unit.
Sure.
When you move across the world away from family, and it it definitely is a challenge, but it's also, I think, just a tremendous opportunity for the family and for my kids. I have three, as you said, I have three young kids who've had to acclimate to a new, completely different culture. And we're not in London where all the international schools are. Like, I don't know any other Americans where I live right now.
Mhm.
So we're very much sort of getting the full experience of being in the English countryside.
What's been some of the unexpected blessings of being in a different culture and being in a different place?
Appreciation for, and this is not in any way to speak ill or negatively about my current adopted home, but I have an immense amount of appreciation for the United States. And despite the challenging times that I think that many of us can agree that we feel like we're in, and that's on either side of the political aisle, it's very difficult to appreciate until you are somewhere else. And I was, speaking with somebody the other day about women's rights, and specifically women's rights in sports. Title IX doesn't exist here, and boy, can you feel it. I've had to advocate for my girls at our school because, and they just kind of don't realize that, how sort of advanced the United States is, or we didn't, in terms of women's sports. But, that's just one issue. I mean, whether it's, some of our freedoms, or just there's so much that I have a greater appreciation for. And I think that that's really special.
It's awesome.
Chris, we had a second question for you, but before I go there, I want to give you a bit of a word of encouragement. I don't know you that well. I follow you on LinkedIn, and Ben knows you a lot better, but it certainly seems like you're in between bookends. It seems like you've had this milestone experience very early in your career, also early in your building of your own family. And so now you're in this season almost of an exile, exiled from your home country, and learning new things, and learning how to adopt to different cultures. And it just seems very apparent to me that you're not done yet. And the things that you're doing now are not in waiting, but yet still building, in fortifying and continuing to learn and expand what you're doing. And the right place and time for where you're needed is ahead. And so what I would say is, keep getting up early and staying up late, because you're being prepared for something, and it seems like it's going to be a pretty big deal when the time is right. And it needs that combination of an extremely knowledgeable person of what's going on, along with the grit and spitfire of someone who's willing to go into the arena and make some challenges. And it'll be fun to watch you swoop back in and do that. Maybe it's over in England, maybe it's here. We'll see where it is.
Well, I appreciate that. And I think that patience is something that I didn't appreciate, or haven't appreciated, until I've sort of grown, and certainly in the last 5 years, and seasons. And I, not trying to sound immodest, but I would agree. I think that that I'm ready to build something in the future, and what that looks like, I don't yet know, but regardless, I'm excited about it.
Well, it sounds like you're doing every day your most important job, which is being mom to those 3 kids. So don't forget that. Whatever the other bookend mighty challenge and accomplishment is going to be, it's going to pale in comparison to being a mom to those kids. So the second and final question, kind of along those same lines: what is left yet unfinished that you, Chris Deacon, have the resolve to complete?
Let's see. I'm going to go big here, because why not? And I wish I had the paper. I think my mom sent it to me. When I was 6, I drew a picture of myself in front of a podium with a White House behind it, predicting myself to be the first woman president. Now, I'm not saying that I'm going to run for the presidency, but I do think that if you keep making the right next decision, that what you are meant to do, will build. You will build that. And so, I think I will never take any opportunity off the table. I think you have to think big and dream big. And so, yeah, I might not be a resident of 1600, but, you know, maybe there's something close to that in the future.
There's a lot of people that stand in front of that podium that have a lot of influence and make impact for good and bad. So whatever role it is, in front of the podium would be a wonderful spot for you.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Well, Chris, thanks for joining us on this episode. And thanks to our listeners for joining another episode of Risk and Resolve. We'll see you next time.
Thanks for tuning in to Risk and Resolve. See you next time.